On day 24, we'll start chapter 8. Push through it up to day 27, where we're gonna start chapter 9. For now, we're starting the final part of our book. So as we're beginning it, chapter 8 will serve as a subsequent anchor. It's not directly an anchor chapter, but it's following chapter 7, which is an anchor chapter, and it is still a chapter through which your characters will gather resources. We're now preparing for the end of the story, and without planning the end of the story. So for that, we'll have to review the general cohesion of our story from chapter 1 up to chapter 7, as we're writing chapter 8, because we're preparing the following stories. And wherever your next story is a direct sequel of the story you're writing right now, or it is another kind of story with new characters, with a new genre, with new settings, with a new world, you'll want to establish a form of continuity between them. Now, chapter 8 will follow our traditional 3-scene pattern. In scene 1, if you have to introduce a new location, start with the colors of this location. You don't need at this point to put too much emphasis on the climate or the effect of the light on animals, on plants, but colors are still a crucial element. So if you have to present a new environment or a part of a new environment, focus on the color part of the soul of this environment. If you have to present new characters, same thing. Present them through their issues. You're now establishing in chapter 8, much like in chapter 4, in chapter 5, in chapter 7, you're establishing the final stakes of your story. And now these stakes have grown to a point where you can envision them completely. So you can, from there, already establish why we're getting to the end of the story. Not only where we're getting and how we're getting them, but also the reason. And that's why writing the end of the story, the 10th chapter, was crucial. Because now, as you're presenting these last people, these last settings, these last environments, you want to make sure that the organizations you've introduced earlier have been used as you intended them to be used. They had to be used properly, but now properly is defined entirely by the stakes you've established in chapter 2, 4, 5, 7, and now 8. Of course, the 3 crisis chapters are essential, but we're not getting through that yet until we get to scene number 2. Now, in your scenes 2 and 3 of the 8th chapter, you'll want to put the emphasis, as established earlier, on the stakes. You're now defining the final stakes of your story. And you're defining the final stakes of your story because you're already planning for your next story. You're already establishing essential elements which will be present in your next book, your next movie, your next game. So establishing stakes properly and defining their resolution still by using the quirks of the environment is critical. Now for scene 3, same remark as for scene 2, you want to put the emphasis on the synergy between the resolution of the issue and the outcome of the issue. It allows you to create a smooth transition between your chapter 8 and your chapter 9. And for doing so, you need to put the emphasis on the characters' reaction and how they will impact the relationship of the characters. All we're doing there is what we've done up to this point. We are reinforcing the potential for attachment. No, attachment, emotional attachment between the public and the characters and also between characters and other characters and characters and environment is still our number one goal. So by preparing for the end of the story, we're reinforcing the potential for emotional attachment. We're planning our ending. We're planning our pathway from chapter 8 up to chapter 10. Actually, if you want to be broader, you're planning your pathway between the climax, chapter 6, up to chapter 10, the epilogue. So you're really rethinking the way you've written chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10. So how do we do that? We want to focus on one thing, one main thing. You want to put your emphasis on encounters. Now, we've done it till now. You've done it, but not as deliberately as we're doing right now. Now, what are encounters? Because we didn't define it before. Even if you have a sense for what encounters are. Well, every time your characters meet a new character, that's an encounter. Every time your characters visit a new environment, that's another encounter. So every time your characters get to discover something new, a new element, an object, a character, an environment, an organization, that's a new encounter. And encounters are meant to put the emphasis on two aspects: relationships and individuals. Now, relationships, if you want to imagine them just by taking back a look at our relationship map, relationships are the links between each of your characters. They're the arrows, the vectors, which are driving your character to one another. For example, an arbiter will be attracted by a rival because she's relentless to some degree, because of her relentlessness. An advisor will be attracted by an enticer because she's enthusiastic. Behavior traits guides characters toward one another. That's what relationships are. That's how relationships are created. Strengths attract, and weaknesses allow character to create a form of resonance. Now, the individual aspects, well, that's the character themselves. Now, we have our four main roles, and in order to create a full individual, you have to put your role into perspective. So you get your role, you have already two character traits, and you add two additional character traits, and that's an individual. And then you had a goal, which is directly related to these four behavior traits. Now, how do you put emphasis on relationships and how do you put emphasis on characters? Well, now you want to put the emphasis on the relationship just as we did before. You want to put the emphasis on the relationship between the protagonist and the threat and the menace, and the menace and the protagonist. Now, this circular logic, this clockwise logic is always the simplest way to act, but you can also add support character, multiple layer support character. The protagonist supporters, the threat supporters, and the menace supporters. And all these individuals which are supporters, all these organizations you've created, they're allowing you to establish a balance between the individual wills and the collective will. Either the individual wills of your individuals or the individual wills of your organizations, your group, versus the collective will of an organization or the collective will of the world. And by establishing these relationships, by putting the emphasis on these relationships, you restore a balance between individuals and collective. So you want to go through that again. Protagonist, threat, if she's still there, menace, protagonist, threat, and you go on like that. It's a cycle. And as you're writing your dialogues, I suggest that you put your protagonist first. She got the first line of dialogue, then it's the threat, then it's the menace, and then in the next bit of dialogue, it's the menace which starts, then the protagonist responds, then the threat responds, and in your third bit of dialogue, it's the threat which initiates the dialogue, then the menace or the protagonist, whatever, responds. And you see, if you function this way, you have a lot of combinations, but you have always one thing present: the initiating factor. You always have one character which will initiate the conversation, the dialogue, the action, the reaction, the will to create problems, or the will to create solutions, actually, if you want to put it more simply. Now, where does that happen? In chapter 8, you can present what will be your final setting, singular. Or you can choose to have a suite of final settings, plural, So a new setting in chapter 8, a new setting in chapter 9, or a new setting in chapter 10, or just one in chapter 8 and chapter 10. You're free to establish whichever combination you want. All you have to remember is you need to have at least one final setting, because if not, you don't have an ending. The fact that you can establish multiple final settings, and the fact that you may want to establish one final settings, it's just a matter of scale, really, because all your ending, so from chapter 7 to 10, can happen in the same region, and then or just in one building, and then each chapter happens in a different room. It's always a matter of scale, and you're the one defining which scale you're most comfortable with. So in the final settings, you'll have to justify the presence of 4 characters. You'll have, just for the stakes, you have to establish the presence of 4 characters, and you have to establish the stakes of these 4 characters. How did they evolve from the chapter they were presented in? It may be chapter 1, or it may be chapter 3, or it may be chapter 6 for the menace. 1 for the protagonist, 3 for the threat, and 6 for the menace. Or it can be earlier for any of these 3 characters. And when the support appears, you have to establish the settings and why they're in these last these last locations. Each of your 4, at least 4 main characters should have a reason to be there in this final setting. And you want to articulate these, and that's how, in the most visible way, in the most obvious way, you put the emphasis on the relationships. You choose your 1 to 4 settings, depending if you want to create a new setting for each chapter, and you establish the stakes of each setting, of the encounters of each setting. The very fact, the very reason for each of these settings is that you have the ability, to be more flexible. You offer yourself more possibility, you offer yourself more freedom, more choices when it comes to establishing gradually increasing stakes. But more on that on the next section. Now, if you have any questions on how to review your story, how to edit your story, how to rethink the cohesion of your stories, of your books, of your movies, of your games, please comment. Please add in the comment section a specific question. For example, how do I ensure the cohesion between my chapter 1 and my chapter 2? Because it hasn't been treated in much details. How do I ensure that my characters remain coherent between chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, for example? Or how do I ensure the territorial consistency of my world between chapter, let's say, 2 to 5, to ensure a greater visual cohesion in my environment, in my compositions? So if you have any specific questions on cohesion, coherence, or consistency, please leave it in the comment. The following section will present you the general rules when it comes to cohesion. Now, as said earlier, in your last sections, in your last locations, you'll have to re-establish or establish the evolutions of your characters' stakes, or what the characters are doing in this new location, why they're there. Defining 4 themes. in your story since the beginning allows you to know your 4 main characters. The fact that you're establishing 4 main themes for your story allows you to predict, in most cases, your 4 main characters' reactions, as these 4 themes will be represented by these 4 characters. As these 4 characters will act as allegories for these themes or parables, depending on your narrative choice. The second element, which will ensure that you review your cohesion properly, is to review your story, to edit your story every 3 chapters. Which is why crisis chapters are placed every 3 chapters. It allows you to imagine, to envision, and then to display the evolution of your world. You can also rethink about the information which is available to your characters, to your public, and to yourself. So you want to ask yourself every 3 chapters. You can do it for every scene, you can do it for every chapter, but it becomes critical to do it every 3 chapters. Which piece of information is necessary to my character, to my public, and which piece of information is available to my character and to my public. Doing so allows you to become more deliberate when it comes to giving new pieces of information, or even hiding pieces of information. You're not willing to remove information from your story as you go. No, so you want to keep a track of what was essential, because there are pieces of information which were not as useful as you may have imagined in the beginning of your story, and you may want to put these into maybe a quiet mode for your actual story and reuse them later in a sequel or in a different story which will display the same themes. Now the easiest way to display which piece of information is essential through your chapters, through your scenes, is the titles. So your titles, and try to give your title to every scene as well. You'll need titles for your chapters, but try to name your scenes as well, and try to summarize them just in one sentence. If you wish, we have a video on how to summarize a whole story in 1 sentence. We also indicate in this video how to summarize a whole chapter and a whole scene in 1 sentence. So, link in the description if you want more information on that. Titles are the easiest, or at least the clearest way to display what the chapter, what the scene is about. So if you want to be sure that your public, that your character get the piece of information they needed to get, go through titles to display it. Finally, through your whole story, you want to make sure of shifting your perspective. Not necessarily the perspective which is displayed, because, for example, you may not want to write what the menace is thinking, because it may ruin some surprises, it may really damage the rhythm, but you want to imagine at every moment, every scene, what the menace is thinking about, depending, of course, on which information she is available to her. So you want to go through the perspective of your protagonist, obviously. You want to go through the perspective of your support, and even maybe sometimes display the perspective of your support, either directly in dialogue or by showing what she's thinking, what your support characters are thinking of the character they chose to align with. You may even want to do so for your threat. You may want, at some point, maybe in one of the scenes in your chapter 3 or chapter 6, display what the threat is thinking directly, in a description, what she thinks of the protagonist, what she thinks of her own team, what she thinks of the menace. You may want to do that. Now, for the menace, in most cases, you you'll not want to let the public access to our thoughts, because the thought process of the menace in most cases should be hidden. You don't want to display it. But for the all three other characters, you may describe directly what the characters are thinking about in order to show the perspective much more. Now, what would you do if you had to ensure the continuity from the end of this story up to the next? Even again, if the next story is not a direct sequel. Well, you want to display a continuity between your stories. Either there's a direct continuity or an indirect continuity through the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere is still light, it's still colors, and put a big emphasis on colors, but you don't need to display the climate so much, the impact of the climate on animals or vegetables, for example. But colors are still critical. You also want to put an emphasis on the effect your four main characters have on the atmosphere, and that goes through the soul of your environment, the soul of your location, because your four main characters will have a direct impact on this soul, especially the menace. She'll have to act directly on the soul, but same goes for all the other four characters. Well, how do they do that? Well, by displaying their stakes, their goals, the evolution of their motivation, their goals, how does it transcribe through the stakes presented in the environment. Now, what more do you want to put into light to ensure the continuity of the story? Well, the cycle pattern, the cyclical nature of a story, and that's why in most situations fables are the go-to format, the go-to frame to use. The cyclical nature of a story allows you for the most continuity. You want to write your ending first. You start by writing your ending, in fact, and then you want to write your first chapter accordingly. And we've already seen that. But what is there to add now? What's more to add? Well, we didn't tell you how to do it. Exactly. No, we told you, okay, write the 10th chapter first, and then write your first chapter. But which element should be displayed? Here in chapter 8, for example, and in chapter 9, and we'll do the same thing for chapter 10 when we get to the epilogue. Which element should be displayed directly in order to create the cohesion of the cycle? Because you want to create a cycle between the end of your actual story and the beginning of your actual story, but also between the end of your actual story and the beginning of the next story. So it's two cycles really, still between beginning and end, but from your actual story to the next story. Which element do you want to display there? First, future elements. And you want to work on two scales, short-term scales and long-term scale. Now the shorter scale is, well, the actual chapter you're gonna write. So you're writing chapter 8, so the future, the near future is chapter 9, 10, eventually 11 and 12 if you want to follow this formula. But for now, the short-term future is just chapter 9 and 10. So be sure to display in chapter 8 what's gonna happen in chapter 9 and 10. And then there's a long-term future. And it is especially useful if you're writing a sequel. You want to display elements which will have an impact on the future stories. If you're writing a trilogy, you want to put right now in chapter 8 elements which will have an impact on your second book, your second movie, game, and then the third episode of your trilogy. Now, what are these elements? Because there are some essential elements. You want to put into the light here the stakes of chapter 8, 9, and 10 and how they will impact the first chapter of your second book, of your third book. right off. You want to put it just as they appear to you, as clearly as possible. For example, if your characters are all getting into a mine in chapter 8, because now there's a specific ore that the menace or the threat or even the protagonist is willing to acquire. Maybe the other two characters are willing to acquire it, or maybe one of them is trying to destroy it. And whichever resource we're talking about, the stakes will go accordingly to the place you are. So now, how do you create a continuity thanks to that? Well, depending on your character's motivation, so either acquire the resource, destroy the resource, deplete the resource, get a monopoly on the resource, everything will happen in the same place, the mine. Now, there are different levels to your mine, and maybe first level chapter 8, second level chapter 9, and finally last level chapter 10, wherever it's the descending on ascending mine. And your chapters, your stakes will be gradually progressing. So now what will happen in chapter 1 of your second book and chapter 1 of your third book? Well, the stakes won't be as high because it's a new chapter 1, but they shouldn't decrease too much. And if you want to keep the public engaged, you want the stakes of chapter 1 of your second book to be a little lower than the stakes of chapter 1 of your third book. So from chapter 8, 9, 10, it's gradually progressing, but gets a little bit down in chapter 1 of the second book, and then right up in chapter 1 of the third book. Same remark for identities. Since your characters are here for a resource, for getting a resource, their identities will be impacted every time you have a new stake, every time you have a new loss, every time you have a new crisis, a new issue. Now, identities, and the identity of the character, is the part which will change the less from one book to the next, from one movie to the next, and so on. The behavior of your characters should evolve. The action and reaction of your characters should change. But the identities, not so much, because this is what defines your characters. And if you're changing your identity too much, and again, this is a possibility, you can completely do that, but you have to be aware that changing the identity of the character makes her another character. You're not preserving the continuity here, per se. But by preserving the identity and changing the behavior a lot, so again, if you want to change the behavior, you just modify the behavior traits, you can install continuity while preserving the essence of your character, the identity of your character, the soul of your character. And finally, same remark with scale. You're picking the scale. So if you want to establish a continuity, and let's say we get back to our mine example, and you want to have an ascending scale. First book, the first episode, the first movie happens in a small region, a small mining region. Let's say it's in the orange part of our map. And in this small mining region, there's a community which depends on the mine. Now, on our second book, we discover that this resource is also needed in a lot of the parts of your world. First of all, there's an industrial region which depends directly on it because this region trades it and refines it. There's another region which is made of floating spheres, which depends on this mineral because this mineral is the fuel for the flotation system, and so on. There may be a set of transportation of vehicles which depend directly, much like the spheres, on this ore because they use the ore to fuel their vehicles. You go for that. So the scale of the first episode is just the region around the mine. The scale of the second episode is the whole country, the whole mountain country plus the industrial region, and then the final scale of the world is the whole world. You present all the regions of your world and why this ore, why this mineral is used everywhere in your world. And that's how you ensure continuity. So again, present the atmosphere through the colors, create a cyclical story, present focus on the future, and present stakes, identity, and scale.